Namaskar. It gives me great pleasure to be speaking to you today from the World Health Organization, and please accept my greetings and best wishes to everyone. We are living in an increasingly vulnerable and fragmented world, and while we have all been living through this pandemic for the last 2 years, something which has been the first time after the Second World War that we have seen global disruptions. In this case, of course, it's a health shock, and so we have seen a huge impact on health, on deaths increasing around the world, on hospitals being overburdened, healthcare workers being burnt out. But also it's had a huge impact on the economy and the livelihoods of people, particularly impacting those living in the least developed parts of the world. On top of that, we are now facing a war in one region of the world, but conflict in many parts of the world. In fact, almost all parts of the world have ongoing conflicts, and we have something like close to 300 million people today that require humanitarian services, and this number is increasing year on year. The impact of climate change and the whole concept of climate refugees that need to migrate away from their places where they have lived all their lives in search of better opportunities, in search of livelihoods, is again a reality for us in the 21st century, and all indications are that climate-induced stress leading to more migration, leading to more violence and conflict is likely to increase. Unless, of course, we do something about it. So wherever there is a problem and a challenge, there's always a solution. But the solution does require certain basic principles to happen, to be followed, for it to come to a positive conclusion. So the trajectory of where we want to go as a human species is really in our hands now, more than ever. I would like to reflect on some of the lessons, and particularly the importance of leadership, of collaboration, of solidarity, and I want to emphasize the role that science and technology and education and literacy plays and will continue to play a very important role going forward to solving all of these different challenges that we talked about, whether it's another pandemic, whether it's climate change induced hardships, whether it's antimicrobial resistance, whether it's difficulties with clean energy and green energy, or with solving the problem of water. All of these crises will have scientific and technological solutions. So if the private sector is going to make these products, how do we come to an agreement with them which is a win-win, where there is affordable access to the products? At the same time, the private sector, of course, is not going to do things for free, so they also need an incentive. But during a pandemic, the main incentive should be saving of lives. It should not be profits, and unfortunately we haven't seen that prioritized. We've seen some of the companies making huge amount of profits in the billions of dollars, and large segments of the population today, 2.8 billion people around the world, have not received even one dose of the vaccine. So about 55% of the world, or close to 60%, has received at least one dose, but you can imagine that 40% of the population still waiting for that first dose, and therefore the chances of this virus continuing to evolve and mutate is continues to be very serious. And then my final point is really going to be around how do we build a culture of trust between governments, between public health experts and communities, and that has to be built on transparency, on good communication, on a two-way dialogue, being able to, and we've seen there was a recent paper that was published that showed that countries which had the lowest mortality due to the COVID pandemic, there were 2 or 3 factors. One, of course, was the age profile and demographics. If you have a younger population, like we saw in a lot of Africa and Asia, you had less mortality because COVID did impact the older people more. But the other factors were the prevalence of non-communicable diseases. Again, countries and populations which had high rates of diabetes, hypertension, etc., had a higher mortality rate. But the really interesting one that came out was trust. Trust between people within the society, and also trust between governments and people. And they took Denmark as an example and said that if all countries had the levels of trust that were seen in the survey in Denmark, which had very high levels of trust of the citizens and the government, then the pandemic, you could have actually averted about 25 to 30% of cases globally. So that's a huge impact that this one element of trust actually has, and this is going to have impact on all the other issues that we talked about earlier today. So building that trust is a long and painstaking process, and as I say, it has to be a two-way street, and this is something that needs to start young. It needs to start in school and then be built from there. And it also applies to health literacy, because we've also seen the other big challenge we've had is the misinformation campaign, what we call the infodemic. People are bombarded with information mainly through social media channels, and a lot of it is actually disinformation, untrue, false. So it's very important for children and young people to appreciate and be able to distinguish something which is credible and something which clearly is a disinformation campaign. And so that type of awareness can only come through good science education, focusing on rationality, a questioning mind, and then of course trust also comes into this, and having good role models. And that's where I think leadership is extremely important. And the kind of leaders that we have can make a lot of difference, especially on young minds. And so it's really up to all of us who are in positions of responsibility to have the kind of be a role model for the younger generation, and be able to mentor as many young people as possible. So I wish to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and I wish you all very well. Thank you. Namaste. Jai Hind.